This week's Torah portion begins with the book of Deuteronomy. And it's important we get some preliminaries dealt with this week to get the most from it. I think this is going to be a surprising book to most of you. It's going to surprise primarily in the concepts it so beautifully and articulately presents about God, the land of Canaan, the law, other important subjects. In fact, I would submit to you that in many ways, Deuteronomy is the Moses version of Yeshua's Sermon on the Mount. Now, here's why. Moses began this book by recounting how it is that Israel got to where they are at this moment. In the doing, he expounds on at least 50% of all the laws that had been given at Mount Sinai 39 years earlier. In other words, he will go through almost all of the law point by point and tell Israel what it is that they are to conclude is God's purpose for this law. Now, I want to preface this by saying that it is technically a misnomer to equate the Torah and the law of Moses as being the same thing. Okay, the law of Moses is only a part of the Torah, a section of it. The remainder of the Torah covers creation, early man, the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, so many more people, Israel's time in Egypt, how they got there, how they escaped, a lot more early history of mankind in general, Israel in particular, which leads up to the history-changing giving of the law to Moses on Mount Sinai. Now, we're going to find that Moses takes the law from its rituals and system of behaviors to a moral code encompassing a higher spiritual level of godly principles that governs all things, anywhere, during any era. And critically, that system depends upon the faithfulness to YHVH of those who practice it. And he'll explain why certain rituals were laid down the way they were, what their higher purpose is, the God principles they demonstrate, and therefore why they're important or to be obeyed, as ordained. Now, this was necessary because circumstances were about to change drastically for Israel. I mean, overnight, when they left Egypt, they went from being organized city dwellers to desert nomads. It took them a long time to adapt to that change. Now, that was about to be reversed. The living members of Israel at the time of Deuteronomy, they knew nothing of the life of their city-dwelling fathers. They were born as nomads. But now, they had arrived at the eastern bank of the Jordan River, and once they crossed over, they would leave behind their nomadic lives, the only way of life they knew, to become city dwellers. This too would take time to adapt. Therefore, we'll have Moses saying that what he's about to tell them is still the law that was enacted back at Mount Sinai almost 40 years earlier. And this is the way that the first generation of the Exodus had practiced it up to now. However, says Moses, I'm going to tell you what it all means. And as we prepare to enter the promised land, this is how we should understand it and how we should execute God's instructions when we settle there. In other words, as time, circumstance, technology, and more change and evolve, how exactly is one to live out the purpose, the precepts, the intent of each law and command? And it's likely going to have to look a little different. This is what we believers of the 21st century struggle with today. the church long ago took a shortcut. They simply declared all of God's laws and commands abolished. And the church authorities invented a bunch of new ones to follow. In the New Testament counterpart of Moses' speech, we have Yeshua's in the book of Matthew, doing and saying basically the same thing. Moses took the law from the primary physical, behavioral to a higher plane in Deuteronomy. In the Sermon on the Mount, Yeshua takes the higher element Moses gave to the law in Deuteronomy, much of which had been lost. He moves it to a yet purer spiritual level. Yeshua says, and I paraphrase, "Here is historically how your ancestors thought of this command of God, how they carried it out, how the traditions of men have infected it. I'm here to tell you what it actually means, how it's intended in heaven." Now remember, 13 centuries had passed from Moses' day to Yeshua's. Nothing about Yeshua's era was the same as it was in Moses's. Now, what we essentially have is the first mediator of God, Moses, expounding on the ideal of the law in Deuteronomy, and we have the second and best mediator of God, Yeshua, expounding on the ideal of the law in the book of Matthew. Now, the reason and conditions for the first expounding of the law in the Bible by Moses was his coming death and the subsequent entry of God's people into the promised land of Canaan, God's earthly kingdom. The reason and conditions for the second expounding of the law in the Bible by Yeshua was his coming death and the subsequent entry of God's people into God's kingdom, a spiritual kingdom. Can you see that? Now, I hope this makes sense to you for a number of reasons. First, if you can understand the parallel I just drew for you, then you have a good basic context for understanding the Torah portions I'll present to you in Deuteronomy. Second, this is but further dramatic proof of God's established patterns that begin in Genesis and are never ending. They repeat again and again, but as we move through the Bible, we see these patterns begin as mere dust and clay, physical, and progressively move into a higher and yet higher plane until at the end of the Bible, all the laws and patterns established by YHVH are at the absolute, ultimate spiritual perfection and essence that YHVH has planned and ordained for his creation, because essentially there will come a time when heaven and earth will be together, the lines of heaven and earth start to blur, and eventually they fully merge into one. And third, it helps to establish that the newness of the so-called New Testament, or a New Covenant rather, a New Testament, is not about a new set of principles or even additional principles, or as some principles, laws, abolished and replaced by different ones. Rather, the newness is that the Messiah of the Old Testament has finally come. And he is Yeshua of Nazareth. And all that was promised, beginning with Abraham, has come with him. And so the process of redemption has been advanced towards the ultimate world to come. In other words, the constant drumbeat we have always heard in the church about love, grace, peace, mercy, redemption as being a new thing that is the core of the New Testament, simply not true. It was first introduced in the Torah, and much of it right here in Deuteronomy. Now let me comment about another aspect of the Sermon on the Mount parallel with Moses' address in Moab to the people of Israel. Actually, it was a series of 3 addresses in Deuteronomy. And I think it ought to be characterized more as a sermon than a re-rendering of the code of laws given as an oracle from God at Mount Sinai. See, that is why the Sermon on the Mount's called a sermon, not an oracle. It was Yeshua preaching and teaching on the law, not him creating a second or a new law. It was the same on the mountain in Moab with Moses as orator. He was preaching about the law, not making new laws or abolishing old ones. So what we will study in Deuteronomy will help to set the context, not just for the books that immediately follow it, like Joshua and Judges, but for the remainder of the Old and New Testaments as well. Now, perhaps one of the most difficult things for a believer, especially for a Christianized believer, who has come to understand the era of restoration for Israel that we seem to have entered, is how to approach that section of the Bible that has been relegated to the trash bin by the Constantinian church institution for so long. The Old Testament and especially the law. Now, we who speak fondly of the Hebrew roots of our faith have determined to struggle with how to properly apply it to our lives and faith walk as opposed to the rest of our brothers and sisters in Christ who simply dismiss it as irrelevant. For us, how does a modern believer keep Torah? Are we to avoid wearing clothes of mixed cloth? Are we to reestablish a society where males decide everything? Are we to eat food grown under the biblical kosher's ordinances? Should we reestablish cities of refuge for those who kill accidentally? Are we to celebrate the biblical festivals and observe the biblical Sabbath? Men, are we to adopt rabbinical Jewish traditions like wearing kippahs, sporting full beards, and reading from Jewish prayer books? Men, should we insist we sit apart from women during congregational services? See, women, should you see yourselves as unclean during your period, remove yourself from your husband during that time, and immerse in a mikveh upon the end of the cycle? You see, the thing is that Moses in Deuteronomy draws attention to the fact that the issue he is addressing from this hilltop in Moab is not whether these laws and principles still exist, but how to apply them and reapply them in the inevitably evolving societal conditions and in various locations, and for him, most immediately, in Canaan. Yeshua did essentially the same, but he was concerned with something concerned with something that Moses just didn't have to contend with. Moses didn't have to tell the people that the law would continue, because he was addressing the people of the law, and any thought that the law would be terminated was unthinkable. But 1,300 years later, on a hill overlooking the Galilee, Yeshua was speaking to a crowd of Jews and Gentiles, and he needed to make it crystal clear that nothing he said should be construed as abolishing even the slightest sliver of the law, nor was he changing the pronouncements of the prophets. So midway through his sermon, he pauses to say this: "Do not think I've come to abolish the Torah or the prophets. I haven't come to abolish them, but to complete. Yes, indeed, I tell you that until heaven and earth passes away, not so much as a yud or a stroke's going to pass from the Torah, not until everything that must happen has happened. Indeed, not until heaven and earth passed away, he said, could such a thing even be contemplated. Therefore, my brethren, pay very close attention these next several weeks to Deuteronomy, because we're going to see how the Israelite society has evolved sufficiently after only 4 decades that there was a practical need for change in the details of observing the law to account for their new condition. We're in that same boat today. Now, Deuteronomy, like all other books of the Bible, was not written in a vacuum. It's not a standalone book. Deuteronomy, like the New Testament, will be misunderstood and misapplied if one does not read and understand what came before it as a foundation. Deuteronomy assumes, and Moses assumes, that many of the things that will be discussed have been known and assimilated into the Hebrews' everyday life for quite some time. So Moses won't define his terms because they had by now just become common knowledge. He won't fully repeat a law of Exodus or Leviticus or Numbers because when he preaches on it, often he'll just refer to a certain law or command in kind of a abbreviated form. Because it's already been given, established in their Israelite society, and so it's understood. Moses will draw on incidents like the golden calf, the Balaam and Balak affair. He'll even speak of what happened to Miriam. What happened to Miriam was so infamous, ingrained in the people, there's no need to explain the obvious, the well-known, that she was punished with a skin disease for her rebellion and exiled from camp until her disease ended. Deuteronomy had an enormous effect on the development of Jewish tradition that would come far into the future. But even before that, the prophets who brought God's oracles to Israel on his behalf would use the verbiage, the imagery that Moses used in his matchless book. Almost 200 of the original 613 Torah commands come in Deuteronomy as a result of Moses further nuancing God's commands. It was needed to address their new conditions. The method that Moses expounded on the law is actually closer to how the rabbis, at least at first, commented on the law. And so rabbinical halakha, that's rabbinical legal rulings, well, they have a form and a protocol much more similar to Deuteronomy than to the four earlier books of the Torah. Now, at this point, I want to pivot to discuss something that is current, it's ongoing, and in my opinion, will be at the heart of the cause for the nations gathering around together in the near future to attack Israel, and thus the war to end all wars, Armageddon. Now, biblically, it all begins with the so-called Holy War that Israel is about to initiate upon crossing the Jordan for the conquest of the land of Canaan. Look, we must be careful not to get sucked into a debate or a defense that the current holy war of the Muslims against the non-Muslim world, and especially against Israel, is the same thing that God ordered in the Torah regarding Israel taking possession of Canaan. This is one of those many instances when the meaning of a small phrase changes over the years and it takes on a different context, but that small change in meaning can have large repercussions. I have heard Muslim spokesmen, news commentators, journalists, even Christian pastors discuss the Muslim holy war as being comparable to the Old Testament holy war of Moses and Joshua upon Canaan, and therefore questioning why Christians ought to necessarily have to be on Israel's side. The difference between the two is night and day. Jihad, Islamic jihad, is about forcibly and violently converting the world to their religion. It's about an army of Muslims establishing a worldwide caliphate by any means necessary. That is a one-world Islamic theocracy. It's about killing those who choose not to convert, as a direct instruction from the Quran, although the Quran does seem to give somewhat of an out to Jews and Christians who might have their lives spared if they'll agree to be ruled by Islam and then submit fully to an Islamic government. See, there's no thought in the Torah of the conquering of Canaan in order to spread the religion of the Hebrews to foreigners. I'm going to say that again. There is no thought in the Torah of conquering Canaan in order to spread the religion of the Hebrews to foreigners. This coming holy war was not about converting those of the pagan Canaanite religions to the worship of YHVH and killing the holdouts. Rather, it's a war over land, a very specific called out piece of land. In fact, Moses carefully recounts in coming verses how the Israelites avoided conflict with the Edomites and the Moabites wherever possible because these Gentiles rightfully owned the land they possessed, since the Lord has set it aside for them and assigned it to them. I mean, does that surprise you that God would ordain certain territory for Gentiles, non-Israelites, and then enforce their right to keep it? Well, it shouldn't. Although we call him the God of Israel, YHVH makes it plain he's the God of everyone, of everything. His reign supreme over all the earth, over heaven, the universe, whatever else might exist beyond, if there is such a thing. So of course he has predetermined who shall live where, when, under what circumstances, and so forth. And that includes both Gentiles and Hebrews. The place he assigned for the Hebrews was Canaan, not for them to own as land barons, rather as land tenants, with YHVH as their landlord. So we must never fall prey to the specious argument that what Islam is currently doing is somehow akin to what the Hebrews were doing as they conquered Canaan. Nor should we imagine 21st century Islamic terrorism or their terrorist purpose and mindset as being akin to the Old Testament conquering of Canaan. God's only earthly kingdom was to be within the well-defined boundaries of what was currently on record as the land of Canaan and not beyond. There was no command to convert Canaanites, nor was there a command to commit genocide upon them. The goal was for the Gentiles of Canaan to be driven out. Only those who chose to stay and fight to the death rather than leave were subject to being killed. Now hear me, please. In perhaps the oddest irony, it is not the Old Testament God who says to Canaan and other foreigners, convert or die, as so many misinformed Christians think. And such is at the core of much misinformed Christian opinion on the Old Testament, the law, the Jewish people. Rather, the only God-ordained convert or die scenario in the Bible, it's in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, when Yeshua is leading the saints in holy war, usually called Armageddon, in which the only people who will be allowed to remain alive on the face of the planet are those who accept Yeshua as Lord and Master. Kind of reverses the whole situation, doesn't it? Those who rebel or resist will generally not survive. Armageddon is a battle for the entire planet, not just for Israel. There is nowhere for those who are against the Lord at that time to move to, except to the grave. Moses, for a short time, then his protege, Joshua, would lead God's people in a battle for an earthly kingdom located in a specific place. Yeshua has instructed us, his modern-day proteges, to lead God's people in a battle for a spiritual kingdom. Joshua would lead a battle using spears and swords. Yeshua has instructed us to put down our spears and swords. and to lead a battle using primarily our faith, the gospel truth, and our loving deeds. Yet when he returns, he will fight a bloody physical war, just as Moses and Joshua were about to do. One more thing about holy war, and I do this because it's at the core of why the Old Testament is so maligned and our New Testament so misunderstood. A holy war is not one that is led in the name of God, but the one that is actually led by God. It is made clear in the Torah that God has gone ahead of Moses and Joshua to defeat those whom are intended to be defeated. In essence, all that's left for Israel to do in a holy war is to come in and pick up the pieces. God would deliver the enemy into their hands. Their numbers, their weapons, their strategy, their technology matter little. It is made clear that God is the supreme commander of the Israeli military. It's also made clear that this holy war was ordained by direct oracle from God. It's not at the choice of Moses or Israel. No human government can declare a holy war. The church cannot declare a holy war. And by the way, neither can Israel. Only God can declare holy war. And he already has. Now I'm going to conclude this week's Parsha with this one thought. One of the most important things Israel was to face as they crossed over the Jordan was a change of government. That was part and parcel with them leaving their nomadic lifestyle for a settled one that now involved land ownership. Now tribal leaders would be princes over not just people, but territory. And in time, national leaders that sit above the tribal princes would become an unfortunate but necessary accommodation in order to keep Israel as a unified family and nation. So although God warned against it, he also said that inevitably Israel would have a king. But how would this system look? How should a king be chosen? How ought he to reign? Couldn't look exactly like Moses had it organized out in the wilderness. Even so, in order for it to be godly, it had to follow the same standard Moses had been following. Well, the standard God had given to Israel was the law. And as a practical matter, it had to have been given first before any system of government could be established. Otherwise, men could not properly administer God's justice. The first system happened in the wilderness. Now a differing system would need to happen in Canaan, yet still operating under the same spirit and intent. God's justice is completely wrapped up in his laws. His laws aren't just mechanical codes and ordinances or a robotic system of do's and don'ts. Part and parcel within the law is the desire, his desire and call for mercy, love, grace, forgiveness. Today, the Jewish state of Israel has forsaken God's law. It's almost completely secular. They have invented their own systems, installed their own ideals according to their own philosophies. The results are apparent. Within the institutional direction of Christianity, believers have thrown aside God's laws and thus have become divided into literally thousands of denominations, each with their own set of rules. any thought of actual unity and brotherhood is a distant memory. Almost all Christians deny that God's original justice system even exists anymore. And there's the rub. By setting aside God's law in the church, we cannot fear no man, for judgment is God's. Instead, our judgments are of men who use a particular denomination's bylaws and articles of faith as their standard, based on the belief that what we do is according to what seems right in our own eyes. Moses in Deuteronomy did not change the nature of God's laws. Yeshua, God's Son, did not change the nature of God's laws. It behooves us as his followers only to ask, how do we best carry out those biblical laws in our time, in our circumstances, and in the spirit God gave them first to Israel, and through Yeshua, they're passed on to us.
For more teachings and information, visit us online today. Come and be a part of our fellowship here at The Seed. Enjoy worshiping and learning God's Word with us.